we've created our workflow demo app in Android Studio, and we got a file here called main activity, which is inside the Java folder and inside our application folder. It has a class called main activity, and inside that there is an overridden function, so on create, that says set the content view r.layout.activity_main. So our user interface is being set up here with R is a class that's generated as we create our app, and it's going to be used by Gradle to ready everything for our Android device. So we're going to load a layout named activity_main. And if you remember, we have a resource folder over here, and inside that is a layout folder, and there's our activity_main. So we can double click on it. I also have a tab up here. I'm going to open up the tab because that opened previously. And just to show you, you can also give yourself a little more real estate space by just dragging that editor window over to the left, and it gives us a little more space here. So in our editor, we have our toolbox up here, or our palette, and in our template that we chose, that we have by default a little text view, and views are what we might refer to as controls if we're coming from the C# world, but they're the objects that make up our interface. So we have a text view here, which of course is a view that displays text. Below that we have a component tree that's going to show the objects in relation to each other as a hierarchy. So we have this one object called Hello World. By the way, if this is too small for you, there's a way to zoom in. There's also a one-to-one correlation. So you can use these controls down here to zoom in and zoom out of your views. So there are two windows here. The one on the right is what we call a wireframe. It's a representation of what we see here on the left, which will show us basically our design as we set it up, and it's going to show us colors and so forth that will not be reflected in the wireframe. A couple things to point out here. There's a drop down that shows us what type of device we are looking at here in terms of our design. So if I were to go to, say, a tablet, let's choose a large tablet, then it reflects the tablet view, in this case landscape, and I could rotate that using this little rotate button. So I say I want to view this in portrait. Okay. Different size phones. So here's a 1440 by 2560. I have a Samsung device that's a little bit older, and it's 1080 by 1920. I'm going to go back to that view. So we can change which device we're designing for. And we'll see later how to design more for multiple devices. But if you have an Android device you'd like to design for just for yourself, then I would set this to be whatever your device is, just like as I suggested, creating an emulator that has the same attributes as your physical device. I can also change the API version here. So right now I've got 29, and we'll come back and look at these other tools a little bit more later. So right now I have this object. It's a text view, and the object is defined by attributes. So there's an attribute panel over here on the right-hand side. I'm going to open that up. And I'm also going to expand this a little bit so we can see it a little bit better. So I can see in this panel that my object that's selected is a text view. And right now it has no name. And I see a little icon for a text view, which is the AB. And you'll see that those icons reflected here as well. So there's a space here to give it an ID. And objects, as we refer to them in code, need an ID. I'm going to give this an ID of TV Hello. I chose TV because I taught Visual Basic 20-some years ago. And a lot of Visual Basic developers at the time used what's called Hungarian notation. So a button started with BTN and a label started with LBL. You can Google Hungarian notation and find different references in terms of the letter designations used for different types of objects. This is not part of most Kotlin developers or iOS developers or even C# developers, but I use it in all those areas. This is something that became very much my nature. So you can name these however you like. I do suggest using camel casing. So capitalize the first letter of each subsequent word. Can't have any spaces here, but you can use underscores. But I'm just going to name it TV Hello. That tells me in my code as I'm looking at it, oh, this is a text view, TV. Below that, we have declared objects. These are the attributes that have been applied. Now, when we created our app through the template, it created this object for us and gave us some attributes. And right now, those attributes primarily consist of a width and a height, which basically says just wrap the content, and then layout constraints. And that's what these little squigglies are. These are layout constraints to our parent view in this case. And then the text, which is hello world. If I want to change that text, I can type in here and say hello SMCC. And if I press the enter key, we're going to see that reflected in our visual design here. So as I make modifications in the attribute panel, they are going to be reflected here. They're also reflected in the underlying XML code. So let's take a look at that. So now in the XML code, you'll see that android.text equals hello SMCC. We see the ID we added there of TV hello. And we get a little designation in front of that of the @ plus ID. We'll come back and talk about that later. I'm going to go back to design mode. So these are the declared attributes. I'm going to jump down towards the bottom, and we have a listing of all attributes. These are all the attributes that are associated with text views. And you'll see there are a lot of them. As I make changes to any of these attributes and apply them, the attribute will be shown up here. You see now we have our ID attribute applied that we modified up here. So I kind of like this about Android Studio. It gives us an area to see only the attributes that we have actually specified. The next thing is the layout. And these little squiggly lines represent constraints. And they're constraints to, in this case, the object that's a child of, which is our parent, the actual screen of our layout. Now we can modify these by changing values in each of the drop-downs. I can also grab my object and move it to where I want it on screen. And notice as I do that, it now has added a layout constraint horizontal bias and a layout constraint vertical bias. So this shows me that I'm roughly centered. It's 0.498. I must have moved it just a little bit. I can come in here and make this 0.5, so I can specify a value. And maybe I want the layout constraint here to be a third of the way down. I could say 0.33. And as I make changes here, notice that visually that also moved down. So as we make changes in the XML code, in the visual editor, or in the attributes, they all tie in together. Again, I'm going to jump over to the code and notice that I now have a horizontal bias of 0.5 and a vertical bias of 0.33. There are also little chevrons here that will wrap the content. And this little circle here that's applying the constraint, if I point to it, I get an X. And if I click on it, it will delete that constraint. And we're going to see our text view drop all the way to the bottom because there's no longer a constraint to the top. Now I didn't want to do that, so I'm going to do a Control-Z to undo and bring it back. So there's lots of ways we can work with these constraints. Now I'm going to grab the bottom handle and I'm going to stretch out my text view, probably make it a little bit wider. As I do that, notice it changed our layout width and layout height to be some measurements. And my text within the bounds of my text view is up here over on the left. I want to have that centered. So I can change that by coming down to the attributes. I'm going to go to text align. And I'm going to choose center. And when I press the enter key, I'm going to scroll back up and we'll now see we have a text alignment attribute declared and applied to our object. And we see the text is in the center. All right, let's add another object. I want to add a button. So I'm going to click on my buttons palette I'm just going to drag this top button over and down. I want it about 2/3 of the way. And then I'm going to set some constraints here. So a couple ways I can do this. I can grab the circle and drag to the object. That's going to set a constraint between my button and the text view. And then I could enter a value here to spread that down, or I could simply pull it down. I can do the same thing on the right and drag to my edge of the screen, bring it back over to the left, and maybe I want to have it also dragged to the bottom. So now I've set up constraints for this button in relation to my parent, but also in relation to this object. I can select a constraint and delete it. So now there's no longer a constraint from this object to the text view, from the button to the text view. But I can also grab this and I'm going to create a constraint to the parent. So I can choose which objects I want to have my constraints set to. So maybe I want this to just be basically 2/3 of the way down, so I can also use the vertical bias here. It's at 67%. That's at 50%, and you'll see the vertical bias 0.674, a little more precise than 2/3 of the way. But if I want to be really precise, I could do 0.667. Now my ID by default here is named button. I'm going to change that to BTN SMCC. Again, the Hungarian notation for a button is BTN. That's just my habit. And SMCC, all uppercase, as our school. I'm going to press the Enter key. I'm being asked, do I want to rename it and refactor it? I'm going to say yes. And we'll see now that reflected in the declared attributes. And again, if I go over my code, there is my button attribute with the name of BTN SMCC. We see our layout constraints. Now I want to change the text here. Right now it says button. I want that to be SMCC. All right, so I'm going to change the color of my button. I'm going to scroll down and find background tint. There's a little button here. I can click on that button on the right-hand side. Allows me to pick a resource. And there are some values already in here by default. And I can choose one of these. There's also a way I can create my own colors. And one of the ways I would do that is going into values, going into the colors and creating new colors. I'm just going to choose something that's here. Let's make it this teal. I'm going to say OK. You see that the button has changed colors. Now, I'm going to scroll back up a little bit because there's also in here some common attributes. This is a great place to look as well. You can sometimes get lost in this listing of all the attributes. So in the common attributes, these are the ones that tend to get changed more frequently than others. And you'll notice the background tint is here as well. So again, if I click this little button, I can change it one more time. I'm going to scroll down in my list, and I want the hollow blue bright. So that is my interface. I now want to do some code. I can do one more thing here, and that is, again, in the, let's select my button. In the common attributes, there's an on click, and I can create a reference to an event. So I'm going to call this click SMCC and just simply press the Enter key. So if we look back at our code, I now have an Android.onClick click SMCC. That's going to be the name of my function that I'm going to create to have something happen when the user clicks this button. In the next video, we'll continue our workflow by modifying the Kotlin code of our activity. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the Android App Development Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.